Good evening. Nice to see you. Welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to reporters and writers and editors and all different people who are putting stuff out so you can get informed about what's really going on and what they're thinking about when they put stuff out. And in our second segment, we have just a wonderful, fascinating historical segment about culture in the borough of the Bronx. But right now, uh, the transportation reporter for WNYC and Gothamist is Stephen Nessen. First time on the show. Nice to see you, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
Great. I'm going to use two words. Some people think they're dirty words, but I'm going to say congestion pricing. It's upon us. I mean, barring some litigation that is going to challenge it, which is probably going to go on for years. So the MTA gave final approval. What are the MTA's hopes for putting congestion pricing in place in New York City?
Well, the big overarching goal is, of course, to reduce traffic in Manhattan, to reduce the number of vehicles that enter. You talk about pre-pandemic levels. Traffic is back much higher than it was before COVID, while subway and bus ridership is still, 30% below pre-pandemic levels. So first of all, the goal is to reduce traffic, of course. But according to state law, the MTA is required to bring in $1 billion a year on tolls from congestion pricing. And of course, as I'm sure your listeners are aware, the price tag is going to be $15 for most personal vehicles to enter the tolling zone between 5 a.m. and 9 p.m. And even on the weekends, it starts a little bit later. It's 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And of course, trucks and big trucks are going to pay even more than that, $24 and $36 respectively. So, it's sort of a two-pronged goal to both decrease traffic, but also to raise, $1 billion a year for the MTA, which it will use to generate $15 billion worth of bonds.
And they claim, yes, the 15 billion they claim.
They're planning on it. Their financial plan is actually dependent on that. All the construction on whether it's signals, new train cars, even the Second Avenue subway extension and other big projects are all on pause right now until congestion pricing is finalized.
Wow. That is it's an extraordinarily ambitious plan. I'm going to speak as somebody in the Bronx who goes into Manhattan often. I am going to be emceeing a dinner on somewhere in May, and just below 60th Street in the evening. In the past, I probably might have taken my car. I mean, I'm pretty savvy. I know where I could park my car in Manhattan, but there's just no way that I'm going to go down and pay $15 to get downtown. You mentioned something to me just beforehand, that there is mitigation money available for the borough of the Bronx. I wasn't aware of that. Explain what that is and how that might work, and will it help people like me or people, frankly, who are worse off than I am, who want to come into Manhattan?
So the mitigation has to do with the environmental assessment that the MTA was required to do. So for years, they did this extensive study looking at, 28 surrounding counties, intersection by intersection, really honing in on what could happen if congestion pricing goes into effect. Will certain parts of the city, parts of New Jersey, parts of Connecticut even see some sort of bottleneck or increase in traffic that could have an adverse impact on the environment? That's environmental assessment. Assessment. They're assessing the environment. And while overall they found that traffic, this is going to help the environment pretty much overall across the board. But it's true in the Bronx, so-called environmental justice communities, which are communities that are already impacted with traffic, pollution from traffic.
Boy, I know that like I know my own name, my friend.
High asthma rates, as you know, and disproportionate access to medical care and all those things that contribute to environmental racism is part of that. So they looked at that, they studied that, and on the Cross Bronx Expressway, there is a slight increase in traffic, in truck traffic.
Wow.
Not enough that it would derail the plans, but enough that it raised concerns with the feds. So the MTA agreed to spend I believe it's $130 million on mitigation efforts. Some
Wow.
of that's going to include air purifiers for schools that are near the highway. Some of that's going to include a push to electrify the Hunts Point Market trucks, which are belching out a
Of
lot of
course.
carbon dioxide. They're going to
Well,
try to electrify them.
Steve, that's really helpful, and it's helpful to know for the people of the Bronx. One of the things, as soon as it was announced, as the plans were unfolding, people in the northernmost communities, let's say people in Woodlawn, people up in maybe Northwest Bronx and Riverdale, people in the more northern central Bronx up near Williamsbridge and those areas up there are very concerned that people from the northern, because we're of course connected to the northern suburbs, are going to park their cars in the Bronx somewhere. We lose not only all our parking spaces, but maybe we're going to all of a sudden get development instead of housing. We're going to get garages, et cetera, et cetera. So this money will go to some of those things. Do you think some of the private people who might be affected will get money? I mean, I wonder who's going to. I guess it's the council will determine how it's distributed.
Well, it's going to be the MTA that determines where that money goes.
Ah,
Part of it is in the discussion with the with federal officials about how they're going to implement congestion pricing. But that concern about the concern from people who live outside of the tolling zone about drivers coming in from the suburbs is perhaps somewhat, a little bit of a wait and see. The MTA is not concerned about it. I've done interviews in Washington Heights, which is right next to the GW Bridge, and they have complained for years that New Jersey drivers cross the GW, park in their
right.
neighborhood, and take
And
the A train
jump in the train.
to the
Right.
city. So
Right.
they're really concerned about an uptick in that neighborhood. But again, the MTA says, according to their studies, their extensive modeling, that they just don't believe that is going to have, a material impact.
Yeah, you said that, and I smiled. I mean, we've all been around long enough to know. What's the objection, the most reasonable objection that you've heard? And I know you've studied this. Goodness, I was just looking within the last couple of weeks, like what, 3 articles, 4 articles. I mean, you're watching this every day. What do you hear that is most valid, maybe in terms of criticizing it, or are they all? It's because we don't know what it's really going to turn out.
Well, I think one of the most valid concerns is perhaps people who already pay a toll to enter the zone. There are several tunnels, the Holland Tunnel, the Lincoln Tunnel,
Right.
the Queens Midtown, and the Hugh Carey, where
Right.
drivers already pay a toll. And essentially, when they come out of that, they're right in the tolling zone. They're going to get
Yeah.
tolled again.
Right.
So,
Although that's a discounted toll, it may not be $15. It may could be 12 or something like that, and you only
right.
get right. So they're saying a double toll, and of course, the state of New Jersey is suing New York City to because of this.
Yeah.
One of the things, and I mentioned to you, and I don't know if you saw it in the Daily News today. There's an op-ed piece about it impacting disabled people, which is very interesting because if in many cases, if you haven't put, the escalators and elevators in all the subway stations as planned, then how can we can't ride the trains? So you're really making it so we have to drive into Manhattan. That's to me among the many valid question marks.
Well, one of the sort of exemptions that is baked into the program is that vehicles that transport someone with a disability are exempt. So, but how is that going to work out is the big question. And the MTA hasn't released its information yet, but apparently, or according to the plan, anyways, drivers will have to apply, and you can have one vehicle per family with a disabled person in it. They can apply to get this exemption so that their vehicle, the family vehicle, whatever it is, can enter the tolling zone without paying.
What do they get? They get a tag on their plate or something like that. Some other technical way of doing
And
it.
it's all digital, so they would know your plate. They would read your plate in the system and wouldn't charge you.
Right. And that's another, I hadn't thought about this, but that's another thing, is your confidentiality. They can pretty much, I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, you're going across the Whitestone Bridge, you paid Easy Pass, we could figure out how to trace that. But all those cars will have a record of going into Manhattan. That's kind of interesting. I have to say, and one of the numbers I saw in the Daily News op-ed piece today is that the MTA has a legal commitment to make 95% of the subway stations accessible by, hold your breath, 2055. So I will likely not, I would love to be around. I don't believe I'll be around to see that. And if I was unfortunate enough to live near one of the 5% that still didn't make it, I'm never going to see it. It's those kinds of things are kind of funny to me. I don't have a question with it. I just happen to notice that number. So this is happening, right? This is going to happen. And what is the date? July 1st?
Well, we say it's going to happen. The MTA, it wants to count on June 15th. But as you mentioned
15th.
at the top, there are several lawsuits pending.
Right.
At least 6. There's a bundle of them in New York, and there's New Jersey, the state of New Jersey. Governor Phil Murphy himself is suing the federal government to block this from happening. And until those cases are resolved, we can't say with certainty that the MTA is going to flip the switch on June 15th and start tolling drivers.
This is the first city in the United States that's done it, but it's had apparent success elsewhere. I mean, and that's well documented. I mean, I haven't studied any of that. London, right? I forget, Sweden somewhere.
Stockholm, Singapore.
Stockholm, that's the other one I heard. Yeah.
I did do an interview with one of the leading experts in Stockholm about it, and they had a very interesting way of going about it. They did it sort of as a trial run for half a year.
Okay.
And then they put it on the ballot. They made it a referendum.
Oh.
Should we continue doing it or not? And
yeah, that's not going to happen here.
No,
not unless there's a lawsuit requiring it.
But, they found 2/3 of voters were against it before it went into effect. When they saw the decrease in traffic and how nice the streets were, 2/3 of voters voted to continue doing it.
Well, maybe we'll like it. I want to be optimistic. Listen, we didn't have time. We're running out of time here. But we got to ask about these autonomous vehicles and all the other things. Taxi dispatchers charged with taking bribes from cabbies at the airports. I guess you have a busy work schedule.
It's always busy. There's always something on the transit.
Somebody's driving in those streets right now. Listen, you're the best, Steve. Thank you so much, ladies and gents. Stephen Nessen, who is the transportation reporter for WNYC Gothamist. Thank you for your expertise, your knowledge, and for sharing it with us on the Bronx Buzz.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Folks, we'll take a short break. And when we come back, as promised, a wonderful historical segment about our home borough, the Bronx. Don't go away.
This year, BronxNet Community Television needs your support. For more than 30 years, we've been providing community programming shows, education courses, and access to our world-class television studios, a place where Bronx residents can call home. Community leaders and organizations can share their ideas, stories, and passions for what matters to us. We are still going strong, working hard each day, building new studios, creating new jobs, and expanding our digital inclusion opportunities so that your voices can still be heard. Every dollar counts. Donate to BronxNet and keep the momentum going and continue building a better Bronx with BronxNet.
Okay, back with you on the Bronx Buzz. My favorite thing on this program is when one of my friends comes on the show, and one of my buddies is Elena Martinez. She is a folklorist and also, of course, co-founder of the Bronx Music Heritage Center. Hi, Elena. Nice to see you.
How are you? Nice to see you, Gary.
Always good to see you. Elena, you know, because I shared it with you, I attended a Zoom presentation that you made. I guess it was through the Tremont Library, right? Is that what it was?
Mm-hmm.
About the history of theaters in the Bronx. Now, you and I just debated for a moment whether it's really true that there were more jazz clubs or jazz houses in the Bronx than there were in Manhattan way back in the 100 years ago. We don't know if that's true, but there were some wonderful theaters in the Bronx. Why don't you just give us the landscape, the expanse of what that's about?
Well, I would say that event, that presentation, was about just venues in the Bronx in general, music venues in the Bronx, and mostly Latin music. We were looking at the Latin music scene, like in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But theaters were a big part of that. Theaters were a big part of that landscape. And most people, if you go through the Bronx, of course, there's you could go down the Grand Concourse. There was a bunch of theaters there. Southern Boulevard itself, you go from Bruckner, follow Southern Boulevard all the way up to 174th. There's a lot of theaters, and you just see them dotted all over. Now, a lot of them now, you wouldn't know they were theaters. Like some of the buildings are still there, but they've been converted into other things. I think I forget there's one on Southern Boulevard. There's now a laundromat, but like the shell of the building is still there. And then
a laundromat in a classic old theater. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's but the shell of the building is still there. But a lot of them are, you can see the facades and things still there. But the Bronx has had, probably, I'm sure, all over the city as well. But the Bronx definitely had a large landscape of theaters because there were building booms, and in the teens and the 30s in the Bronx. So these were the times when people were moving up, north to settle into the Bronx. And there's residential buildings are built, but also people they want things built because they're living there now, and people need stuff for recreation.
Well, sure. And I think from the people who owned the properties, they couldn't make a go of it. I'm just curious, and I didn't get to ask you during that Zoom call, but I'm just curious, is this akin to the number of movie theaters we had? Were in other words, did movie theaters double as performance houses, or were they really separate concert houses and movie theaters? Because I know my neighborhood, every neighborhood had movie theaters, and of course now what do we have? Two in the borough.
I know.
61st
Sadly,
Street and one in Bay Plaza, and that's about it.
But they became them. A lot of the old theaters. And what I love about theater, the theater's history to me sort of reflects the sort of like changing demographics of the borough. Just if you did, like, you could do a study of just the theaters themselves and see how the borough has changed. Because early on, early theaters, if they were built in the 20s and 30s, are going to, they're live shows. They're going to be a lot of vaudeville type shows. So vaudeville, live music, and sometimes other entertainments like boxing, things like that. So there were like these like live events there. Now you get into the 40s and 50s, and there's still live events there, but there's a mix with now, if you're in a Spanish-speaking neighborhood, there are going to be movies there, but they're going to be usually Mexican movies, because this is the golden age of Mexican cinema. From the late 30s to the 60s is the golden age of Mexican cinema. And they're putting out, the Hollywood of Latin America. They're putting out just tons of movies with many famous actors and musicians, and even the people younger. I mean, my father's generation, who maybe grew up in the Hollywood movies of Gene Autry and all the singing cowboys. That was the same thing in Mexican movies. You had all these like mariachi singers who were cowboy movies of the time,
and they were in the BX in the Bronx.
Oh yeah, and the one story I think to me, which is most illustrative, and it really changed my thinking about things, was that when I was in high school, Linda Ronstadt came out with that album, her mariachi album, very famous mariachi album.
Yes, I remember.
Great album. And my dad played it all the time. And I was just like, Dad, and just never thought of you as someone who liked mariachi. And then I learned that when he grew up on Simpson Street. My dad grew up on Simpson Street. When he was a young kid, they went to the movies all day. Like they would get like a quarter and go all day long to go to the movies. And what would they see at the movies? They would see some Hollywood movies, yes. They probably would see some John Wayne cowboy movies, but they also saw Mexican movies. So, and the Mexican movies were full of mariachi. So ask any Puerto Rican Rican of that age, ask any Puerto Rican of that, who came of age in the 50s, they are going to love mariachi
Wow.
music because all those theaters, local theaters in the Puerto Rican
That's what
communities
they
played
did.
that.
Let's show some of the pictures you gave to us to show, just so people can get a sense of it. My buddy Anderson has them ready to go. Let's see the first one. Okay, this is the Freeman Theater.
The Freeman, this is unfortunately, this was right across from where the Bronx Music Heritage Center is now, and that's like our subway stop. You can see in the background there.
Oh yeah,
and
right.
The shell of that building was there about 10 years ago. That shell of that building was still there. Not the facade wasn't there, but the shell of it was. But then about like 8 years ago, they just totally demolished it, and there's a Children's Aid Society there now. But that was. You look at that theater. I mean, look at it's really nice looking. It looks like again, the Bronx gets this bad rap, but you look at that as a beautiful building. The inside there, I didn't give you any interior photos, but the inside was just beautiful, beautiful seats, and a lot of these theaters, the Paradise, all these different theaters.
I remember the Lowe's Paradise. I mean, I had my high school graduation there, and of course the beautiful roof, the ceiling. So if you tell me that these were almost as spectacular or as spectacular, I know exactly what you're talking about. I probably should have pulled. I have pictures from the interior of the Lowe's Paradise. I should have pulled.
But I think it's good to remind people that like they think of the Bronx and devastation and all the other stuff, but there were these really beautiful, majestic venues, for people to go to and experience music and film.
Which really, and I'm preaching to the choir here, is really the foundation of, or among the foundations of this culture that people don't fully understand yet. That's why we're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
All right, what do we got next? I have it on my list. Yeah, there it is.
Okay, I put this one because this is the all the way to the end, to the right, you see that part of the building that's a little bit higher. That's the Bronx Opera House. Now,
yes,
the rest of that building was also very famous because it was a Latin music venue for many years throughout the 50s and 60s under different names. The Bronx Casino, the Caravana. It was one of the hottest Latin music venues for people like Charlie Palmieri, Pacheco, the Charanga orchestras, all kinds of music.
And we mentioned this is on 149th Street.
149th.
I mean, I've walked by there 100 times.
And but of course, they made the boutique hotel a few years ago. The Bronx Opera House Hotel is there now, and they are which is nice that they're sort of building on that history, the Bronx history, and that opera house was sort of like a second run opera house, a second run sort of house for like plays that were in Manhattan to come up to.
So it wasn't only opera; it was called the Opera House.
But I think they had a lot of shows, sort of like Broadway type shows, sort of things.
All right, let's go to the next.
Oh, that's the Boulevard. Now the Boulevard is one of those places that just take away that facade. I mean, I'm talking about not the facade, the marquee. Take away the marquee. And you can see that building on Southern Boulevard, right before you hit where the L comes around by Simpson Street. You walk by there. It's actually a Planet Fitness now. It's a Planet Fitness, but they kept that whole facade, and you can see where it says Boulevard Theater on the sort of the arch. And again, one of these beautiful theaters. And again, it's amazing. That's not too far from the Bruckner. If you start walking at the Bruckner, you're going to pass the Spooner, the Art, then you hit the Boulevard Theater, then you hit the Star, then you hit the Freeman. I mean, you just every few blocks, there's these amazing theaters. So there was this big boom, of building these theaters, like in the early part of the 20th century.
One thing it's hard not to notice is the architecture. I mean, it wasn't like, I hate to say what we do now is we put up square
glass
buildings,
boxes,
square, of course,
boxes.
And here they just took such care to create artwork, to create beautiful architecture. All right, we got a couple more. Let's do them before we run out of time. These are just amazing.
So this one, right in the middle of the picture, you see like a long sort of marquee, the Spooner Theater. The Spooner Theater, again, that facade is still there. It's really hard to see from this photo, from the angle of this photo, but that facade is still there. Wow. It was a Duane Reade a few years ago. I forget where it is now.
Where is that? Is that Southern Boulevard?
That's only a couple blocks down from the Boulevard Theater. It's right at the intersection of 163rd and Southern, right before you hit the Bruckner Boulevard.
Uh-huh.
And further down if you go further down on that picture, you see the marquee, but then right after that is the Hunt Point Palace, which was the largest dance hall in the Bronx. But it was connected to this theater, the Spooner Theater, which was built really early, I think before 1920, by it was an actress. She had her own troupe, Cecil Spooner, And her husband bought the theater for her. That she named it after herself, and it was Cecil Spooner was this actress. She had this theater. She eventually, that I don't know why they stopped. They didn't have it anymore, but it became, a movie house later on. Years later.
Now, as far as seating, do they have hundreds of seats? They seated 1,000, 2,000 people?
I don't know the number for the Spooner, but some of the other ones, like Freeman and the Teatro Puerto Rico, which I think you have an image of, they have like over 2,000.
2,000 people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Big. Some of the ones I've seen numbers like 1,600 for some of them. So they're big. They're big.
Let's show one more, and then I want to just make some kind of conclusion and relate it to our culture here in the Bronx. This is Teatro Puerto Rico.
I'm glad you put this one last, because this is sort of my favorite, because I guess to me it really encapsulates the sort of trajectory of the immigrant experience, or just the changing demographics of a neighborhood. This was called prior to 1940. This was called the Forum Theater. The Forum Theater, and it was built early on. It was one of those places that had vaudeville. Vaudeville for the Irish and Jewish communities, boxing. I think the Italians did boxing there. It's a theater for the communities. And who were the communities? The new immigrants who were part of the Bronx in that early part of the 20th century were Jews, Irish, Italians. That was a Forum Theater. After World War II, of course, you get a large influx of Puerto Ricans migrating from the island to New York. A lot of them start moving to the Bronx, and now you have a big, in that neighborhood, South Bronx there in Mott Haven, Melrose, you have a large Puerto Rican community. So now it's not, it's called the Puerto Rico Theater, or Teatro Puerto Rico in Spanish. Right. That theater, again, was one of the large ones, and it's also the center of what they would call farandula, the sort of show business and the Latin music show business of the time, and all the major acts from Puerto Rico would come there. And there was a circuit. There was like
Elena, we're going to run out of time, and so I want listen. I know you could go on. I don't know what we would do without you for many reasons, but really reclaiming this culture, and to me, it defines what's behind all this resurgence of culture, and for us to finally understand fully, what the sources are of our soul, of who we are in the Bronx. Real quick, last question. We're going to see the Bronx Music Hall soon, almost.
Yeah, the theater isn't finished yet, but we're going to be doing starting events in the lobby of the Bronx Music Hall on April 12th and 13th. And one of them is our other artistic director, Bobby Sanabria, will have his big band there on April 13th. So
what a day, what a night.
So we hope to see you all there when our first show is in the new space, even though it's not completely finished. But
we got to run. Elena Martinez, you're just the best. Folklorist, co-founder of the Bronx Music Heritage Center. We need you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gary.
Okay, we're going to take a goodbye. I guess it's time to say we'll see you next time. The curtain don't fall and the creek don't rise. We'll be back. Thanks to Stephen Nessen, too. He did a great job, too. We'll see you. Goodbye.